Hello and welcome to a three-part lecture here on Tink Talks. Three-part lecture on microbial diseases of the skin and eyes. And this lecture is intended for my microbiology students, but of course, anyone interested in microbial diseases of the skin and eyes, you're welcome to join in the discussion, and I'm sure you will find it to be interesting, educational, and stimulating all at the same time. So let's begin. So we're going to look at skin itself, the anatomy of the skin, and some of the characteristics of skin that assist it in resisting infection, some of the mechanical and the physical barriers to pathogens, and also some of the chemical barriers as well. So we'll look at salt here first. Salt from our sweat, and so we have, the sweat glands, of course, are bringing up mostly water, but also other waste products and chemical compounds, and in that is salt. And that salt creates a salty environment on the surface of our skin, and that inhibits microbes and their ability to colonize us because this creates a somewhat hypertonic solution or a hypertonic environment for these bacteria and other microbes to colonize our skin. So any bacterium that is capable of colonizing our skin has to be able to have some kind of salt tolerance to it, and we'll call them halotolerant. That's a term that's often used for microbes that can tolerate salty conditions. We produce lysozyme, and lysozyme is an enzyme that we produce abundantly. In fact, in the human body, lysozyme is the most abundant enzyme, and lysozyme hydrolyzes or breaks down peptidoglycan. And so as a result of that, especially applies to gram-positives, because that's what they have on their outer layer. Above their cell membrane, their plasma membrane, they have this thick layer of peptidoglycan. And the lysozyme is capable of hydrolyzing it or breaking it down. And so gram-positives tend to be more susceptible to lysozyme than gram-negative bacteria do. So we have this lysozyme that protects us as well. Fatty acids from sebum inhibit pathogens, so the fatty acids lower the pH, and so they create a hostile environment for some bacteria, an environment that they cannot normally, that they're not able to survive in because the pH is low. Skin, depending on the region, and different regions of our skin have different levels of pH. We can have skin pH as low as 3. And as high as 5 or 6. Typically the range is about a pH of 3 to a pH of 5. And like I said, the pH varies from one area of the skin to another. And so these fatty acids are what contribute to that. So some regions of our skin are producing more fatty acids. They're producing more sebum. They have more sebaceous glands, and so therefore it lowers the pH. So this is going to inhibit microbes from colonizing. Skin is dry and its secretions are acidic, so there's not much water there. I mean, if you look at your skin or touch it, it's not like you're going to get wet whenever you touch your hand or something like that. So skin stays pretty dry, which prevents colonization by bacteria and other microbes as well. We produce these peptide antibiotics, so they're proteins, and they're called defensins, and they're cationic, and bacterial cell walls are anionic. So the positive charge of these defenses get attracted to the negatively charged cell wall of the bacteria. They get into their cell, they bind with ribosomes, and then they interfere with protein synthesis. And these are peptide antibiotics that we're producing naturally within our skin. And so all of these protect us from being overrun with bacteria, fungi, mainly those two, bacteria and fungi. Now there are, of course, some species that reside on us, and they're happy to reside on us, but they're non-pathogenic. Staphylococcus epidermidis is the number one bacterium that resides on our skin, the number one member of the normal flora or the normal microbiota. So Staph epidermidis is able to tolerate all these conditions and survive in it, and so they do quite well. And fortunately, they don't make us sick. We'll look at mucous membranes as well, because skin and mucous membranes, there's kind of like a, there's no real distinct ending point between the two. So the skin then kind of becomes or moves into and becomes, associated with mucous membranes, like within our mouths or in our ears or other cavities. So mucous membranes are found throughout the body, of course, and they line body cavities. They have a large surface area. The average person, the average human, has about 4,300 square feet of mucous membranes. That's about six. I have Pierce classrooms. That's the hall that I teach in. It's your average size classroom, and that's six of them altogether. Think about it in terms of maybe the square footage of your house. I don't know if you know the square footage of your house. Probably a typical house probably has around 2,500 square feet. For an average, middle class, 3-bedroom home, somewhere around 2,500 to 3,000 square feet in that ballpark. Well, we've got over 1,000 more square feet of mucous membrane surface area. Mucous membranes are often acidic, and the mucus it traps microbes. And as you know, it's rather thick. It's not a very pleasant thing to think about, but mucus is quite thick. And so microbes get trapped within it. And that's why we produce mucus, for example, in our respiratory tract, especially when we have some kind of a throat infection or an upper respiratory infection. We produce extra mucus in order to trap the microbes in it. So this acts as a physical protective agent against microbes, kind of putting them in this thick, viscous soup, and prevents them then from traveling to other areas and regions of the body. And some mucous membranes, like in the respiratory tract, they have cilia. The cells are ciliated cells which sweep microbes out of the body. And so it acts like what's called the ciliary escalator. And so things get filtered out. They get trapped in the ciliary escalators, and ciliary escalators are covered in mucus. And so they act as effective barriers, acting like a filtration apparatus, and to bacteria, extremely sticky. So to give you an idea, we've got this great surface area. Look at this cross-section of a ureter, and if you notice on the inside part of it, of course, not so much the circular part, which you can see there, which is the muscular coat, so that would be the smooth muscle that wraps around the ureter or mucous membrane. You can see the mucus coat inside. It's got lots of convolutions in it. It's folded up, and this is where the great surface area comes from, because that's the way it is throughout our body. We have all this increased surface area because of all these folds that exist within mucous membranes. And if you look at this ureter cross section, look at the shape of it. Does it remind you of a character? Maybe this guy? So it's Patrick. Patrick is living in our ureters, and that's a strange thought. So let's move on. Normal microbiota of the skin. What's living on us normally? Well, gram-positive, salt-tolerant bacteria that are resistant to drying. So if I could sum up what I said in that first slide about all the characteristics of our skin, what type of bacteria can live on there? That's it. Gram-positive, salt-tolerant bacteria that can resist drying out. So these bacteria produce fatty acids from sebum, which inhibit many other species, so the acidic environment doesn't bother them at all. In fact, they take the fatty acids and they utilize the fatty acids in the low pH then to inhibit other species of bacteria from colonizing. So these are bacteria that have enzymes that work, that's their ideal range, pH of 3 to 5. And a lot of bacteria, they exist in kind of the neutral range, around 6.5 to 7.5. Many species of bacteria live in that range. Well, why do they live in that range? Because that's what their enzymes tolerate. So bacteria that are on our skin their enzymes can tolerate lower pH values. So what do we have predominantly living on us? We have yeasts, which are a group of fungi, staphylococci, micrococci, diphtheroids. So those are the four predominant groups, and one of them, the yeast, are fungi, and the rest are bacteria. And the diphtheroids, it's just a group of bacteria, just diphtheroids. They're like diphtheria bacteria, but they don't cause diphtheria. If it ends in oid, it means it's like its prefix. They're the ones responsible for the low pH acne and dandruff that forms on our scalp. Part of it. They're not solely responsible for the dandruff, but they're a contributing factor to that. And we have a higher population in areas of moisture. So where there's more moisture, there's going to be more. There's going to be a greater population that contributes to our body odor, and so therefore you don't. If somebody says you stink, you can say, "Well, no, it's not me. It's my bacteria." So rather than taking the blame on yourself, don't do that. You don't have to take the blame yourself for your body odor. Blame it on your bacteria, and then you can go on your merry way, satisfied, knowing that it's not you that stinks. It's the bacteria that are on you that stink. And then people, you don't have to take the criticism then. So yeah, whatever. So there are two anthems here, an exanthem and an enanthem. And I'm not talking about the Star-Spangled Banner. Anthem, sorry. Exanthem. So EX is on the outside. EN refers to inside or within. So an exanthem is a skin rash that's arising from another focus of infection. So you have measles, which is transmitted by the respiratory route, and it manifests itself, it presents in the skin. And so you get this measles rash, this is what's called a macular rash that stays flat on the surface of your skin. Rubella, roseola, fifth disease. So these are all, there's another focus of infection somewhere else in the body, and now the disease is presenting itself on the skin, which is pretty handy because now you can see the disease rather than it residing inside the body and you not being able to see it. So there is a visible sign that we can see with these exanthems. An enanthem is just mucous membrane. So it's a rash, but it's on a mucous membrane instead, like the picture here, where you're looking at, I assume that's, I guess, strep throat perhaps. Smallpox would be like that, which nobody has smallpox, but that's how it would appear. You'd get it on mucous membranes. Chickenpox. And you say, well, wait a minute, chickenpox shows on the skin. Well, yeah, but it also shows on mucous membranes as well. Measles, the same thing. That's a picture of measles on the top of the hands. Well, measles also appears on mucous membranes as well. Scarlet fever, roseola, etc. So these are just two very general terms. Exanthems are visible on the skin, and anthems are on mucous membranes, more internal. These are just different terms that are that associate with skin infections. You have vesicles in the upper left, small fluid-filled lesion with some fluid inside of it, not necessarily pus, probably interstitial fluid, for example. A bulla would be a large vesicle, so it's just a size difference. Vesicle's small and a bulla's large. Macule, which is a flat reddened lesion, so there's no inflammation, like with measles. And a pustule is a raised lesion with pus. And a papule is a raised lesion without pus. So we have all these different classifications. Does it have fluid? Does it not have fluid? Is it inflamed? Does it not? Does it have pus? Does it not? So this all gives you an indication as to, is this an infection? Are there bacteria present? Or is this some kind of a rash that's appearing? Or is it just interstitial fluid with, absent of bacteria? So we're not looking at a bacterial infection, for example, but we would be, of course, with a pustule. So we'll look at a couple different species of bacteria that reside on our skin, and we'll look at staphylococcal. And we're going to look at two, Staph epidermidis and Staph aureus. Staph epidermidis makes up about 90% of our normal microbiota on our skin. It's gram-positive, and there's this classification that kind of determines the level of pathogenicity. It's coagulase negative, which means it doesn't coagulate fibrin. It doesn't create clots. That makes it less pathogenic as a result of being coagulase negative. If it penetrates the skin, it can become pathogenic, usually not. Opportunistic, if there's some immunosuppression, for example, or a co-infection, something else, perhaps then you could develop some kind of pathogenic condition, but typically not. Staph epidermidis is typically not a bad guy. In fact, we use it regularly in our micro lab. We experiment with it a lot. We look at it under the microscope. It's not a dangerous microbe to be working with. Staph aureus, now we're getting a little worse here. It's the most pathogenic of the staphylococci group. It's gram-positive as well, as all staph are. It's coagulase positive, which means it coagulates fibrin, which leads to greater pathogenicity. And so you know about toxic shock syndrome, for example, where you have blood that clots and it clots and it clots. Well, Staph aureus is contributing to this clotting. And people that do have it, some people are persistent carriers of Staph aureus all the time. Not to their detriment, it's not causing any pathogenic condition, but it's in their nasal passages. It's a notorious nosocomial hospital-acquired infection, especially on catheters, causing UTIs. It produces a cytotoxin called leukocidin, which kills white blood cells, leukocytes. That's why it's called leukocidin. And it also produces a toxin called exfoliative toxin, which causes scalded skin syndrome, which basically the name kind of describes what it looks like. It looks like you've had boiling water dumped on your skin, and it looks like the skin is blistering and peeling back, and it's red. It looks awful. Of course, Staphylococcus aureus is a culprit for food poisoning, or what I prefer to call it, food intoxication, as well, because they produce an exotoxin that's a super antigen, and it causes a cytokine storm, and it creates this overabundant of vomiting and dry heaving and so forth as well. But we're talking about the skin here, not the GI tract. So here's on a catheter, you can see at the beginning, those are Staph aureus cells. They're on the left, just a few of them. They will form a biofilm, which is on the right. More cells, and in that, what looks like this green slime, there's going to be cells down in there as well. So now they're forming a biofilm, and then they will start producing toxins and becoming more and more pathogenic, leading to an infection. Folliculitis, so that's just infection of hair follicle, and if it ends in itis, of course, that means inflammation, and so we're talking about inflammation as well. Often pimples are going to accompany this as well. Stye is just a term for, it's a type of folliculitis for an eyelash, and a furuncle is a boil. In other words, and that's what it means, it's what the word is derived from. It's an abscess, and it's pus surrounded by inflamed tissue. And because of all the complex chemical composition and nature of a furuncle, antibiotics don't penetrate it very well because they can't get through those chemical compounds. Remember, antibiotics are chemical compounds themselves, and so there's all this stuff that's going on, and it prevents it from penetrating and doing its job of killing the bacteria. Carbuncle, advanced inflammation of tissue under the skin, generalized illness with fever, and it oozes quite a bit of pus. It's a concern among people with diabetes because of the amount of sugar that is circulating through their blood. And so that sugar that glucose just feeds the bacteria, and then their numbers can become epic proportions, huge numbers. Some pictures of them, folliculitis on this gentleman's face. Looks like he hasn't shaved in a while for good reason. A stye, you can see the inflammation of the upper eyelid. I had a stye once, looked just like that. Not too bad. Irritating and itchy, a little painful, but nothing that's going to keep you in bed. There's a furuncle on the back of this gentleman's neck, and then this guy is a gentleman has diabetes, and he's got a carbuncle there forming on his shoulder, and that's a legit picture. You think it looks like it's been photoshopped. Nope, it's real. These carbuncles and people with diabetes, they form quickly and rapidly. You look at that and you think, how could you not know that he's got this giant oozing thing on his back, this giant lesion? And it just progresses so rapidly. The bacteria reproduce so rapidly. A lot of pus formed from that. Some other staphylococcal skin infections, impetigo, the newborn, and you can see this poor little child there in the upper right with the staph skin infection. And the newborns, it spreads so rapidly because they don't have normal microbiota established yet on their skin. They aren't covered in staph epidermidis and other bacteria, and so as a result of that, staph aureus just spreads rapidly, and it creates this painful rash on the skin. Toxemia, like toxic shock syndrome. Scalded skin syndrome, which you can see on the hand of that little child there as well. It's an exfoliative, so the skin peels back. Impetigo, as you can see on this guy's face, this picture is all over the internet. Looks like he has lichens growing on his face or something. This is usually it's a co-infection with strep as well, so it's not just staph, but often strep is growing within it as well. So these are just common staph skin infections. Let's look at a pretty nasty guy here, Streptococcus pyogenes. Strep is bad. Group A, beta hemolytic streptococci, otherwise known as GAS, G-A-S, Group A strep. But we have that beta hemolytic in there because we want to also indicate that it's hemolytic. It lyses red blood cells. It's a common human pathogen, and it's got all kinds of enzymes that can do a lot of damage. It produces M proteins, which prevent complement. It prevents white blood cells from phagocytizing them as well. They can't break down the M protein that is, as you can see in the micrograph on the left, that's protruding off of the cell wall of this bacterial cell, the strep. Hyaluronidase, which is an enzyme that breaks down hyaluronic acid in connective tissue. Streptokinase, which is an enzyme that affects the blood. Deoxyribonuclease, breaking down, as you can see, DNA and hemolysins too. So because of all these enzymes, this it makes them more virulent, much more virulent than other bacteria. And the disease, that if you get group A strep, it can progress rapidly. Erysipelas is a strep pyogenes dermal skin infection. Strep pyogenes, by the way, is the same strep that causes strep throat as well. Can enter the bloodstream and cause sepsis. And that's erysipelas on the top picture there. Invasive group A strep infections, they produce those enzymes that I just talked about, but also this picture is showing the exotoxin A, which acts as a super antigen, so we have enormous amounts of inflammation, basophils and histamine being released like crazy, creating this abundant inflammation, cellulitis, myositis, and necrotizing fasciitis. As you can see, what's happening in this fellow's hand here, his thumb. Looks like, I'm not sure, but it looks like this looks like some kind of a post-surgical infection. It looks like he's got some stitches that kind of like, I don't know, blew apart. And somehow he got a strep infection in there, a group A strep, and created some devastating infection there. This is a mild picture, by the way, if you want to... I don't know if it would churn your stomach or not, but if you're the type of person that would, and I suggest you don't Google image that, but if you want to see some horrific group A strep infections, Google image that, necrotizing fasciitis, and oh my, you're going to see some pretty graphic stuff. Pseudomonads. So we're going to look at this guy here, Pseudomonas aeruginosa. It grows in dense biofilms, and it's a culprit in nosocomial or hospital-acquired infections. It can grow in disinfectants. It can get spread in an environment. Even though you think you're disinfecting, the bacteria are surviving in the disinfectant, and so it gets mopped around, for example, on a hospital floor. It is an opportunistic pathogen, especially in burn patients as well, so they're susceptible to that because they've lost, of course, the skin, the first line of defense. Produces several exotoxins and an endotoxin, and it's, like I said, very resistant. So this is one we associate with watery environments, saunas, hot tubs, pools, and so forth. Our skin secretions raise the pH, which makes chlorine ineffective. And so if a sauna or hot tub has not been regularly maintained by someone who's an organization maybe that's not all that responsible, or they're ignorant about how to take care of a sauna and hot tub properly, this can lead to these Pseudomonas dermatitis outbreaks. Otitis externa, which is swimmer's ear, and like I said, post-burn infections as well. So this is associated with those types of areas. A lot of many hotels have had hot tubs, but have closed them over. They've boarded them up because they don't want to have to deal with anyone staying there getting Pseudomonas dermatitis and then getting in trouble for it. So they don't even bother with the hot tub anymore. I've seen a few hotels and have stayed in a few where that was the case. They've turned their hot tub into one place that I was at. They turned it into a deck, and they put little chairs on it and an umbrella, and I guess that's not quite as good as a hot tub, but that was their best idea. So it causes redness and inflammation. If you've had swimmer's ear, you know that that's painful. I never have, but I've heard that it is. So we'll look at acne, and there are two main types of acne: comedonal acne and inflammatory acne. And so comedonal occurs when sebum channels are blocked with shed skin cells and bacteria. And so we call them whiteheads and blackheads. So the blackheads are not clogged, but they're actually they 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 don't form the pus. There's not the whiteness that's associated, obviously, with the blackheads. So what's causing the blackness? Well, the bacteria that are causing this very small localized infection, I guess you could say. It's not really an infection, but it's a small growth of bacteria. They're oxidizing lipids, and the waste product then, whenever the lipids are oxidized, turns black. Whenever they're consuming the lipids, and then they leave an oxidized product behind. And so that's why they appear black. They lack the pus of the whiteheads, and of course that's why whiteheads are called that. So I think most of us have gone through or had comedonal acne through the teenage years. This has to, of course, do with hormones and the level of hormone secretion. And so during the teenage years, when we are raging hormones, that's when, of course, acne is going to be seen and be visible. Inflammatory acne, this is one that's caused by a specific bacterium. So comedonal acne could be, any number of bacterial species that could cause that. Inflammatory acne is specifically caused by Propionibacterium acnes. And so this is a gram-positive anaerobic rod that is down in the skin, and it's feeding on sebum. Some of the treatments, well, prevent sebum formation. Shut off the sebaceous glands and prevent them from producing sebum. Take antibiotics, benzoyl peroxide to loosen the clogged follicles and open them up, and release all the junk that's building up in there, and perhaps even get some oxygen in there because it's an anaerobic rod and oxygen will be lethal. You can use blue light as well, which produces oxygen in the skin, which will kill the P. acnes bacteria, or a combination of those. Preventing sebum formation seems to be the most effective because you're basically cutting off their food source, but at the same time you're losing the waterproofing for your skin. Sebum is what waterproofs our skin. It's what makes our skin supple. You know that that's the case. Any of you who are in nursing, which many of my students are, they're doing some type of nursing and they're working on advancing their degree. Washing your hands over and over again from patient to patient dries out your hands so much, and so you lose that sebum, that coating on our skin, that keeps our skin supple. Well, you turn off the sebum pumps in the whole body, then that can be that's an issue that needs to be dealt with. So what do you do? I had one student that was taking this drug, and they are pretty serious drugs. They're teratogens, actually. If you're pregnant, you can't take it because it'll cause fetal damage. But what he had to do was it's just lotions, just some over-the-counter lotions, prescription. I'm not sure if there are, which is which. I assume probably prescription lotions would work better, I guess. I don't know if it's necessary, but he had to use lotion all the time. A couple times throughout the day, he'd have to apply lotion to his skin to keep it from drying out. But it was working. He had inflammatory acne, and it did work. And he had tried other things, and all the other treatments were unsuccessful. But turning off the sebaceous glands, that was the most successful one for him. Nodular cystic acne, this is the most severe type. This is what inflammatory acne can become. Patients develop nodules and cysts that scar over, and you can see the different pictures of them. Comedonal, we say just zits or pimples. Inflammatory, now you see the redness and the inflammation. And then in nodular cystic, you can see how it's just much more severe. And this can lead to permanent scarring of the skin. And we want to remember the root cause of acne is sebum production. It's not our diet. So it's not like maybe you've heard old tales that, if you eat too much, you stop eating so much chocolate. Don't eat sugar. It's going to give you acne. It's going to give you pimples. Not the case. It's sebum production, which is dependent upon hormones, mainly the androgens and estrogens. And so this is why we see acne or experience acne in our teenage years whenever we're producing so many of these hormones. So it's not the diet, It's sebum production. And sebum production is dependent upon hormone production as well. So papilloma viruses. So we're going to stop there looking at um, um, bacterial infections, and we'll begin with papillomaviruses. This was actually a good stopping point here, so I'm going to end our discussion here for part one, and then I'll pick up with viruses here with papillomaviruses in part two. Again, thank you for watching. Appreciate you being here, and hope you learned something valuable.